She was just a 12-year-old orphan living alone by the creek. But what Emmy Rose did that morning would bring 500 warriors to her doorstep at dawn. The sun had barely touched the horizon when Emmy heard the desperate cries echoing across the water. She dropped the bucket she was filling and squinted through the morning mist. There, on the opposite bank of the rushing creek, a young native girl was struggling to stand, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Most settlers would have turned away. The tensions between the frontier folk and the tribal lands had been growing thicker than smoke from a prairie fire. Just last week, Silas Morrison had warned everyone at the trading post about venturing too close to native territory. But Emmy Rose had never been like most settlers. She studied the girl across the water, watching as she tried again and again to put weight on her injured leg, only to collapse back onto the muddy bank. The creek was running high from recent rains, its current strong enough to sweep away a grown man, let alone a wounded girl. Emmy's heart clenched as she watched the native girl's futile attempts to cross. The water was too deep, too fast, and the girl's injury made every movement a battle against pain. Emmy could see the desperation in her dark eyes, even from this distance. Without a second thought, Emmy kicked off her worn boots and waded into the icy water. The current immediately grabbed at her legs, trying to pull her downstream, but she fought against it step by careful step. The creek bed was slippery with moss and smooth stones, and more than once she nearly lost her footing. Halfway across, Emmy realized the full danger of what she was attempting. The water was deeper than she had anticipated, reaching almost to her chest. Her simple dress became heavy and waterlogged, dragging against her movements. But she could see the native girl watching her with wide, hopeful eyes, and Emmy knew there was no turning back. When she finally reached the other side, both girls were breathing hard. The native girl spoke in her own language, words that Emmy couldn't understand but whose grateful tone was unmistakable. Emmy gestured toward the water and then to herself, trying to communicate her plan. Supporting the injured girl's weight, Emmy began the treacherous journey back across the creek. The return trip was even more dangerous, as she had to navigate the current while keeping both of them upright. Several times the rushing water nearly claimed them both. But Emmy's determination proved stronger than the creek's fury. They collapsed together on Emmy's side of the bank, both shivering and exhausted. The native girl's leg was clearly broken, and Emmy could see the pain etched across her young face. But there was something else in her expression too, a mixture of gratitude and surprise that this pale-skinned orphan had risked her life for a stranger. Emmy helped the girl into her small cabin, settling her near the fireplace where she could warm up and rest. She brought clean water and strips of cloth, doing her best to tend to the injury despite having no formal medical training. The native girl watched her every movement with intelligent dark eyes, occasionally speaking softly in her own language. As the day wore on, Emmy shared her meager food supply and tried to make her unexpected guest as comfortable as possible. The girl seemed to be the daughter of someone important, judging by the intricate beadwork on her dress and the quality of her leather boots. But Emmy didn't think much about status or politics. She simply saw another young person in need. By evening, the native girl seemed stronger, though she still couldn't put weight on her injured leg. She kept pointing toward the horizon and speaking urgently in her native tongue, but Emmy could only nod and smile, wishing she could understand. As darkness fell, Emmy made a bed for her guest near the fire and settled in for the night. She had no idea that the girl she had rescued was Ayanna, beloved daughter of Chief Dakota, leader of the most powerful tribe in the territory. What Emmy also didn't know was that Ayanna had been missing for 2 days, and that search parties of warriors had been scouring the countryside, growing more desperate and angry with each passing hour. The entire tribe believed their chief's daughter had been taken or killed by settlers. As Emmy drifted off to sleep that night, listening to the creek babbling outside her window, she couldn't have imagined that her simple act of kindness was about to change everything, because at that very moment, Ayanna was using Emmy's own needle and thread to carefully embroider a small symbol onto a piece of cloth, a symbol that would soon tell 500 warriors exactly where to find the girl who had saved their chief's daughter. Emmy woke to the sound of drums echoing across the valley like distant thunder. The rhythmic beating seemed to come from every direction at once, growing louder with each passing moment. She sat up in her small bed, her heart already racing before her mind fully understood what she was hearing. Beside the dying embers of the fireplace, Ayanna was sitting upright, her dark eyes wide with what looked like both excitement and concern. She was clutching the piece of cloth she had been working on throughout the night, and when she saw Emmy stirring, She began speaking rapidly in her native language, pointing repeatedly toward the window. Emmy stumbled to the small opening and peered out into the pre-dawn darkness. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water. The valley that had been empty when she went to sleep was now filled with the glow of dozens of campfires, stretching as far as her eyes could see in the dim light. The drumming continued, joined now by voices chanting in harmonious rhythm. Even without understanding the words, Emmy could feel the power and purpose behind the sounds. This wasn't random noise. This was organized, deliberate, and massive in scale. Ayanna struggled to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured leg. She hobbled to Emmy's side at the window and placed a gentle hand on the orphan's shoulder. When Emmy turned to look at her, Ayanna held up the cloth she had been embroidering all night. The symbol stitched into the fabric was unlike anything Emmy had ever seen. Intricate lines that seemed to form both a bird in flight and a hand extended in greeting. Ayanna pressed the cloth into Emmy's palm and spoke a single word that sounded like friend in her language, though Emmy couldn't be certain. The drums were getting closer now, and Emmy could make out the silhouettes of figures moving between the campfires. There had to be hundreds of them, maybe more. Her small cabin suddenly felt impossibly fragile, like a twig house in the path of a prairie storm. Emmy's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had they come for Ayanna? Had they come for her? Was this rescue party or war party? The stories Silas Morrison told at the trading post came flooding back. Tales of entire settlements disappearing overnight, of conflicts that escalated beyond anyone's control. But when Emmy looked at Ayanna's face, she didn't see fear. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like anticipation, mixed with an emotion Emmy couldn't quite identify. Ayanna kept pointing to the embroidered symbol, and then to Emmy, as if trying to explain something crucial that language barriers made impossible. The sound of hoofbeats joined the drums now, growing steadily louder. Whatever was coming was almost here. Emmy clutched the embroidered cloth tighter, feeling its rough texture against her palm. She had acted out of simple human kindness when she pulled Ayanna from the creek, but now she was beginning to understand that her actions had set something much larger in motion. Through the growing din outside, Emmy could hear individual voices now, calling out in the native language. Some sounded urgent, others almost joyful, but all of them were getting closer to her little cabin with each passing moment. Ayanna limped to the door and placed her hand on the wooden latch, looking back at Emmy with an expression that seemed to say, "Trust me." But as the first rays of sunlight began to creep over the horizon, Emmy realized that trust might not be enough for what was about to unfold. As the first golden light of dawn broke across the valley, Emmy heard the thunderous sound of hundreds of horses coming to a halt outside her cabin. The drumming stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. Through the thin walls, she could hear the soft sounds of men dismounting, of leather creaking, of weapons being adjusted. Ayanna's hand remained on the door latch, but she turned to Emmy with an expression that was both reassuring and urgent. She held up the embroidered cloth one more time, pointing to the symbol and then to her own chest, then to Emmy's heart. The meaning was clear even without shared language. This symbol represented something important, something that connected them. Emmy's legs felt like water as she approached the window once more. What she saw outside made her gasp audibly. Warriors mounted on painted horses formed concentric circles around her tiny cabin, their numbers so vast they seemed to stretch to the horizon. Each man was adorned with feathers, war paint, and weapons that caught the morning light like deadly jewelry. At the center of the formation, directly in front of her door, sat a massive figure on a white stallion. Even from a distance, Emmy could see that this man commanded absolute respect from the others. His presence was magnetic, powerful, and unmistakably that of a leader. This had to be Chief Dakota, though Emmy had no way of knowing for certain. The chief raised his hand, and complete silence fell over the assembled warriors. Emmy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she watched him survey her humble dwelling. His gaze seemed to penetrate the walls themselves, as if he could see everything happening inside. Ayanna took a deep breath and opened the door. Emmy wanted to stop her, to pull her back inside where it felt safer, but something in the native girl's demeanor told her this was necessary. Ayanna stepped out into the morning light, still limping, but holding herself with unmistakable dignity. The reaction from the warriors was immediate and overwhelming. A collective sound rose from hundreds of throats, not a war cry, but something that sounded like relief mixed with joy. Many of the warriors dismounted and dropped to one knee, while others began chanting in their native language. Chief Dakota's stern expression transformed completely when he saw his daughter. He leaped from his horse with surprising grace for such a large man, and strode toward Ayanna, his face showing emotions that transcended any language barrier. But he stopped short when he noticed her injury, his expression darkening with concern and barely controlled anger. Ayanna spoke rapidly to her father in their native tongue, gesturing repeatedly toward the cabin where Emmy remained hidden. Emmy caught her own name mentioned several times, along with words that sounded urgent and explanatory. Chief Dakota's eyes kept moving between his daughter and Emmy's door, his expression shifting through what seemed like confusion, surprise, and something else Emmy couldn't identify. Then Ayanna held up the embroidered cloth, showing her father the symbol she had worked on all night. The chief's eyes widened as he recognized the meaning, and he spoke a few sharp words to his warriors. Several of them immediately began dismounting and forming what looked like a ceremonial arrangement. Emmy realized she was trembling as she watched this unfold. The sheer number of warriors outside her door was overwhelming, but their behavior was nothing like what she had expected. They seemed organized, respectful even, but their purpose remained terrifyingly unclear. Ayanna turned toward the cabin and called out something in her native language, her voice gentle but insistent. When Emmy didn't respond, Chief Dakota himself spoke, his deep voice carrying easily across the distance. Though she couldn't understand his words, there was something in his tone that didn't sound threatening. But Emmy remained frozen by the window, clutching the doorframe for support. 500 warriors had indeed come to her door at dawn, just as the situation had promised. What they wanted from her, what the embroidered symbol meant, and whether she would survive this encounter remained terrifyingly unknown. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the assembled crowd, Emmy knew she would have to make a choice. She could stay hidden inside her cabin and hope they would eventually leave, or she could step outside and face whatever consequences her act of kindness had brought upon her. Emmy's hand shook as she reached for the door handle. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, but Ayanna's encouraging voice and her father's patient waiting told her that hiding was no longer an option. She took a deep breath, whispered a quick prayer to whoever might be listening, and stepped outside into the morning light. The sight that greeted her was beyond anything her imagination could have prepared her for. 500 warriors on horseback formed perfect circles around her tiny cabin, their painted faces and decorated weapons creating a sea of color and power that stretched in every direction. But what shocked Emmy most was the complete silence that fell over the entire assembly the moment she appeared. Chief Dakota stepped forward, and Emmy could see now that he was even more imposing up close. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. War paint decorated his weathered face in patterns that spoke of countless battles, and feathers from sacred birds adorned his long black hair. Yet when he looked at Emmy, his dark eyes held no anger or threat. Instead, the chief did something that made Emmy's knees nearly buckle with surprise. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head deeply, speaking words in his native language that sounded formal and respectful. Then, one by one, every single warrior in the vast assembly followed their leader's example, bowing their heads in unison. Ayanna limped to Emmy's side and took her hand, squeezing it gently. She spoke to her father again, and Emmy heard her own name mentioned several times along with words that sounded urgent and grateful. Chief Dakota nodded gravely as he listened, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail his daughter shared. Then the chief spoke directly to Emmy, his voice deep and measured. Though she couldn't understand his words, she could hear respect in his tone, along with something that sounded almost like wonder. He gestured toward Ayanna's injured leg, then toward the creek, then back to Emmy, as if piecing together the story of what had happened. 2 warriors dismounted and approached carrying something that made Emmy's breath catch in her throat. It was a magnificent robe made from the finest buffalo hide, decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. The patterns were unlike anything Emmy had ever seen, telling stories in threads of blue, white, and gold. Chief Dakota took the robe from his warriors and held it out toward Emmy. When she hesitated, unsure of what was expected, Ayanna nodded encouragingly and gestured for her to accept the gift. With trembling hands, Emmy reached out and took the heavy garment, feeling the incredible softness of the hide and the careful craftsmanship of every bead. But this was only the beginning. More warriors came forward, each carrying gifts that seemed more valuable than anything Emmy had ever owned. There were necklaces made from polished stones, carved wooden bowls that gleamed in the sunlight, and dried foods wrapped in soft leather pouches. As the gift-giving continued, Emmy began to understand that this wasn't just gratitude, this was ceremony. The embroidered symbol Ayanna had sewn represented something specific in their culture, something that had transformed Emmy's simple act of kindness into something much more significant. Chief Dakota spoke again, and this time several of his warriors began setting up what looked like a feast. Emmy watched in amazement as they unpacked supplies that could feed an army, all apparently in her honor. But even as gifts piled up around her and preparations for celebration began, Emmy sensed there was something more coming. The way Chief Dakota kept glancing between her and his daughter, the meaningful looks exchanged between the warriors, and the elaborate nature of this gathering all suggested that saving Ayanna had set in motion something bigger than anyone had anticipated. As the feast preparations continued around her, Emmy noticed an older woman approaching through the crowd of warriors. She moved with the same dignified bearing as Chief Dakota, and the way the men stepped aside respectfully told Emmy this was someone of great importance. The woman's hair was streaked with silver, and her dress was adorned with even more intricate beadwork than Ayanna's. When the woman reached them, Ayanna's face lit up with pure joy. She embraced the older woman carefully, mindful of her injured leg, and spoke rapidly in their native language. Emmy realized this must be Ayanna's mother, the chief's wife, and likely the reason for the desperate search that had brought 500 warriors to her doorstep. The chief's wife turned to Emmy with tears glistening in her dark eyes. She approached slowly, as if Emmy were something precious that might break if handled roughly. Then she did something that shocked Emmy even more than the chief's bow had. She knelt down in front of the young orphan and pressed her forehead to Emmy's hands. Chief Dakota spoke sharply to his wife, gesturing for her to stand, but she shook her head and remained kneeling. She spoke words that sounded like prayers or blessings, her voice thick with emotion. Emmy could feel tears falling onto her hands as this powerful woman honored her in a way that transcended language. When the chief's wife finally stood, she removed a necklace from around her own neck, a stunning piece made from what looked like pure silver, with a central stone that caught the light like captured starfire. She placed it carefully around Emmy's neck, adjusting it with the tenderness of a mother dressing her own child. Ayanna translated something her mother had said, pointing to Emmy's heart and then to her own family. Though Emmy couldn't understand the exact words, the meaning was becoming clear. By saving the chief's daughter, she had been adopted into something much larger than she had ever imagined possible. Chief Dakota stepped forward again and spoke at length to his assembled warriors. His voice carried across the valley with the authority of absolute leadership, and Emmy could hear responses from the crowd, agreements, affirmations, and what sounded like pledges of loyalty. Whatever he was announcing, it was being received with enthusiasm and respect. Then something happened that made Emmy's heart skip several beats. Chief Dakota gestured for her to step forward, and when she hesitated, Ayanna gently encouraged her to approach the massive leader. He placed one enormous hand on Emmy's shoulder and spoke directly to her, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was making some kind of formal declaration. The crowd of warriors erupted in what could only be described as celebration. Weapons were raised toward the sky, voices joined in harmonious chanting, and horses reared and pranced as their riders expressed their joy. Emmy found herself at the center of a celebration unlike anything she could have dreamed possible. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Chief Dakota called for silence once more, and when the crowd settled, he made what sounded like a final announcement. Then he gestured toward Emmy's humble cabin, speaking words that made several warriors dismount and begin examining the small structure with obvious concern. Ayanna took Emmy's hand and tried to explain something urgent, pointing between the cabin, her father, and the vast group of warriors. Emmy began to understand that they weren't just celebrating her heroic act, they were making plans that would change her life forever. One of the warriors approached Chief Dakota and spoke quietly, gesturing toward the creek and the surrounding valley. The chief nodded grimly and responded with what sounded like orders. Emmy watched as small groups of warriors began riding off in different directions, as if they were being sent on specific missions. As the morning sun climbed higher and the celebration continued around her, Emmy realized that her simple act of pulling an injured girl from a creek had somehow made her part of something much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. The orphan girl who had gone to sleep alone in her tiny cabin was waking up to find herself at the center of what appeared to be a major tribal decision. But what that decision meant for her future, and whether she would still be living her quiet life by the creek when the sun set again, remained a mystery that would soon be revealed. The warriors who had been examining Emmy's cabin returned to Chief Dakota with expressions that confirmed what Emmy had already suspected. Her tiny home was barely suitable for one person, let alone worthy of someone they now considered family. The chief listened to their report with a grave expression, nodding as they described the gaps in the walls, the leaking roof, and the inadequate supplies. Chief Dakota turned to Emmy and spoke in a tone that sounded both concerned and determined. Ayanna translated as best she could, using gestures and the few English words she seemed to know. Emmy began to understand that they were worried about her living alone in such conditions, especially now that winter was approaching. What happened next took Emmy's breath away completely. The chief raised his hand and called out a series of commands that sent his warriors into immediate action. Some began unpacking tools and materials from their horses, while others started examining the cabin structure with the practiced eyes of experienced builders. Within moments, Emmy watched in amazement as dozens of skilled craftsmen began working on her humble home. They repaired the roof with remarkable efficiency, sealed gaps in the walls with a mixture that seemed to make them stronger than they had ever been, and reinforced the entire foundation with techniques Emmy had never seen before. But they weren't just repairing her cabin, they were transforming it. New rooms were being added with materials that appeared to come from nowhere, and intricate decorations were being carved into wooden beams that had been plain and simple just hours before. Emmy's tiny shelter was growing into something that resembled a proper home. As the construction continued around them, Chief Dakota's wife approached Emmy with another surprise. She carried a bundle of clothing that had clearly been made by the finest craftspeople in the tribe. The garments were not only beautiful but practical, warm enough for the harsh winters, durable enough for frontier life, yet decorated with such artistry that Emmy felt unworthy to wear them. Ayanna explained with gestures and broken English that these weren't just gifts, they were investments in Emmy's future. The tribe was making sure she would be safe, warm, and provided for through the coming winter and beyond. But there was something more in their actions, something that suggested this went beyond simple gratitude. Chief Dakota called for another moment of silence and made what sounded like the most important announcement yet. His voice carried across the valley with absolute authority, and Emmy could see that even the warriors who were working on her cabin stopped to listen. Whatever he was saying was clearly significant to everyone present. When he finished speaking, the response from his people was unlike anything Emmy had heard before. It wasn't celebration or agreement. It was something that sounded almost like a sacred vow. Every warrior, every worker, every person present seemed to be making some kind of commitment. Ayanna turned to Emmy with tears in her eyes and spoke a single word in English that she had clearly been saving for this moment. Sister. Emmy felt her knees go weak as the full meaning of what was happening finally became clear. This wasn't just about gratitude for saving Ayanna's life. By pulling the chief's daughter from that creek, Emmy had somehow triggered ancient customs and traditions that she didn't understand, but that were now binding her fate to this powerful family forever. Chief Dakota approached Emmy one final time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Though she couldn't understand his words, Emmy knew with crystal clarity that her life as a lonely orphan by the creek was over, and something entirely new was about to begin. Chief Dakota placed both of his massive hands on Emmy's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes as he spoke his final words. Though she couldn't understand his language, the sincerity and depth of emotion in his voice was unmistakable. He was making her a promise, a vow that carried the weight of his entire tribe behind it. Ayanna translated slowly, choosing each English word carefully. My father says, you are now daughter of our people, the creek that brought you together. It will always flow between our lands and yours, but you will never be alone again. Emmy felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the full magnitude of what had happened finally settled over her. A simple act of kindness, helping an injured girl cross a dangerous creek, had transformed her from an abandoned orphan into the adopted daughter of one of the most powerful tribes in the territory. The construction on her cabin was nearly complete, and what had been a humble shelter was now a beautiful home that bridged two worlds. Native craftsmanship blended seamlessly with frontier practicality, creating something entirely unique. Windows had been enlarged and fitted with real glass. The roof now sloped perfectly to shed rain and snow, and intricate carvings told the story of two cultures coming together in peace. Chief Dakota's wife approached with one final gift, a small wooden chest filled with items that would ensure Emmy's survival and comfort through any hardship. There were seeds for planting, tools for hunting and fishing, medicines made from rare plants, and enough preserved food to last through the harshest winter. But more valuable than any material gift was what Chief Dakota announced next. A group of young warriors would be stationed nearby, not as guards but as family, ready to help with any need that might arise. Emmy would have the independence she had always known, but with the security of knowing she was loved and protected. As the day progressed, something beautiful began to happen. Other settlers from the valley, drawn by curiosity about the massive gathering of warriors, approached cautiously. Instead of the conflict that many had feared, they witnessed something that challenged every assumption they had held about the native people. Silas Morrison, the trader who had warned everyone about avoiding native territory, stood slack-jawed as he watched Chief Dakota embrace Emmy like his own daughter. The fear and mistrust that had poisoned relationships between the two communities began to dissolve as people saw the genuine love and respect being shown to one small orphan girl. By evening, what had started as Emmy's rescue of Ayanna had become the foundation for something much larger, a bridge between two worlds that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding. The creek that had nearly claimed Ayanna's life had become a symbol of connection rather than division. As the sun began to set, Chief Dakota prepared to lead his warriors home. But before they departed, he made one final gesture that sealed Emmy's new status forever. He lifted the silver necklace his wife had given Emmy and spoke words that made the entire assembly fall silent. Ayanna translated with obvious emotion. He says this necklace belonged to his own mother, and to her mother before that. It has never been worn by anyone outside our bloodline, until now. The 500 warriors who had come to Emmy's door at dawn began their journey home as the stars appeared overhead. But Emmy wasn't watching them leave. She was looking at her transformed home, feeling the weight of the precious necklace around her neck, and marveling at how one moment of compassion had changed everything. She was no longer just Emmy Rose, the orphan by the creek. She was Emmy Rose, daughter of two worlds, bridge between cultures, and living proof that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. The creek still babbled outside her window, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like music celebrating the connection between all living things. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.